Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second edition of our Experts Insights webinar Rare Disease series. I'm your host, Avery Zimmerman, and today's session is focused on orphan drug, rare pediatric disease, and expedited program designations, FDA incentives to promote rare disease drug development, presented by MMS. As an innovative, data-focused CRO, MMS brings insights from our global team of highly respected data and regulatory experts across 4 continents. Today is Christine Clark, Senior Medical Writer, and Ben Casper, Senior Manager of Regulatory Strategy. As a reminder, your microphones will be muted for this session and we'll send out a recording following the webinar. If you have questions, please ask them at any time in the Q&A icon at the top right of your screen. We'll answer them at the conclusion of today's session. With that, I'll turn it over to the presenters.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ben Casper. I am a Senior Manager of Regulatory Strategy here at MMS. I've been with the company for over 15 years and I've done a variety of orphan applications, both for the FDA as well as for the EMA.
Hi everyone, I'm Christine Clark, Senior Regulatory Medical Writer at MMS with experience in rare disease regulatory affairs ranging from orphan drug designation requests to rare pediatric disease designations and expedited designations. Substantial progress continues in the development of treatments for rare diseases. In 2020, 32 novel drugs and biologics were FDA approved with orphan drug designation status. Notably, 1 of 5 novel biologic approvals in the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, CBER, although not orphan designated, were used in rare diseases. In the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, CDER, 58% of novel drug approvals were orphan designated products. Unfortunately, 1 in 10 or 25 to 30 million Americans is affected by rare diseases, more than half of which are children, and approximately 95% of the more than 7,000 rare diseases have no available treatments. To advance the development of rare disease treatments, the FDA Office of Orphan Products Development, OOPD, grants orphan drug and rare pediatric disease designations to eligible products for the prevention, diagnosis, and treatment of rare diseases. Additionally, CBER and CDER provide 4 expedited program and approval pathways: Fast Track Designation, Breakthrough Therapy Designation, Accelerated Approval, and Priority Review Voucher to facilitate and expedite the development and review of drugs to address the unmet medical need in the treatment of serious and life-threatening conditions. Because most rare diseases are serious or life-threatening with a high unmet medical need, most qualify for at least 1 expedited program. As previously mentioned, this webinar will focus primarily on FDA incentives or designations for rare diseases, specifically the FDA Orphan Drug Designation and its pediatric counterpart, the Rare Pediatric Disease Designation. FDA expedited designations and approval pathways will also be briefly highlighted, as well as a general overview of rare disease and expedited designations in the EU region with highlights of key differences between the FDA and the EMA. The first component of this webinar will discuss features, benefits, and qualifying criteria for each designation. And the second component will focus on similarities and differences between FDA and EMA rare disease and expedited designations. Let's talk more about FDA Orphan Drug Designations and Orphan Drug Act. The Orphan Drug Act provides incentives to sponsors for promoting the development of drugs for the prevention, diagnosis, and treatment of rare diseases or conditions that affect fewer than 200,000 individuals in the United States. These incentives also extend to drugs intended to treat diseases or conditions affecting 200,000 or more individuals, but for which the sponsor is not expected to recover the cost of developing the drug within 7 years post-FDA approval. Prior to the establishment of the Orphan Drug Act, pharma companies were not interested in developing drugs for rare diseases because these conditions occurred so infrequently that there was no reasonable expectation that the costs of research, development, and marketing would be recovered. Essentially, there was no business in rare disease. Abby Myers, the primary American consumer advocate of the Orphan Drug Act and then housewife from Connecticut, had a child with Tourette syndrome, a rare disease. A clinical trial was being run by a large pharma company that later stopped the trial as there was no one to whom to sell the drug. Out of anger and frustration, Abby Myers found the California representative Henry Macklin, and together in 1983, they advocated for the establishment of the Orphan Drug Act. It is often asked whether the Orphan Drug Act made it easier for drugs to be approved, and the answer is no. In fact, the efficacy standards for orphan drugs remain the same. However, the Orphan Drug Act simply altered the economics for developing drugs for rare diseases. This idea gained traction, and in 1999, the EMA followed suit and passed their own orphan drug law. According to Peter Saltiston, President and CEO of the National Organization for Rare Disorders, NORD, more than 9 out of 10 orphan products on the market today would never have been developed without the Orphan Drug Act. So what is the significance of orphan drug designation? Under the Orphan Drug Act, incentives or provisions for orphan drug designation holders, provided FDA approval is achieved, include 25% tax credits for qualified clinical trial expenditures, waiver of the prescription drug user application fee, which is the FDA's approximately $3 million fee for reviewing the application and deciding whether or not to approve, eligibility for 7-year market exclusivity for the first orphan drug approved for an indication, which means that sponsor alone has the exclusive right for the next 7 years since the date of approval to market that active moiety for the disease, Pediatric Research Equity Act exemption, meaning that there are no prior requirements and testing in the pediatric population is not necessary. And notably, orphan drug designation typically puts smaller companies on the map as it provides recognition to their products and generates investor interest. The OOPD also provides grants to offset costs associated with the clinical development of designated orphan drugs. So what are some practical tips for getting designated? One question that sponsors frequently ask is, when should I submit my request for orphan designation? The answer is, as soon as the criteria are met. In other words, as soon as the medical or scientific rationale and prevalence criteria are met. If the sponsor has supporting non-clinical and/or clinical efficacy data to support the scientific rationale for their drug product for the prevention, diagnosis, or treatment of a rare disease or condition, and the prevalence of the rare disease is less than 200,000, then an orphan drug designation request may be submitted to the OOPD at any point during drug development prior to marketing application submission. To capitalize on the incentives and benefits of the Orphan Drug Act, particularly the tax credits for qualified clinical trial expenditures, it is recommended that sponsors request orphan drug designation as early as possible during preclinical development. Depending on the volume of supporting data, the orphan designation request is typically about 22 to 30 pages. Key aspects of the application include the following: a description of the rare disease or indication for which designation is being requested. This is an overview of the disease definition, etiology, clinical presentation, signs and symptoms, diagnostic methodologies, and current therapies. The need for therapy section describes limitations in current therapies and highlights unmet needs in treatment. A brief description of the drug, specifically the active moiety or pharmaceutical ingredient or principal molecular structure and its mechanism of action in the disease. The scientific rationale, which will be described in more detail shortly. Indication of any disease subsets of non-rare diseases and clinical superiority to previously approved same drugs. And the prevalence estimate, which will also be further described shortly. The scientific rationale and the determination of the prevalence estimate are the two most important aspects of orphan drug designation requests. Let's discuss the scientific rationale for a designation request. The scientific rationale is a medically plausible basis for expecting the drug to have an effect in the disease or condition that is the subject of the designation request. Medical plausibility is satisfied using non-clinical efficacy data generated in a relevant animal model of the disease and/or clinical data in subjects with the disease. 2 adequate and well-controlled clinical studies demonstrating statistical significance on a defined endpoint are not required to support clinical evidence of effectiveness of the drug for the indication. If clinical study information in the proposed indication are available, then preclinical study data are not necessary to support the scientific rationale. Studies supporting the scientific rationale should clearly indicate whether the study drug was administered before in a prevention model or after in a treatment model of the onset of disease. Note that the scientific rationale cannot be supported by pharmacokinetic and toxicology data, only efficacy data. Designation requests should not include efficacy data from the use of the study drug in other indications, and unless animal models and clinical data are available, data describing use of similar products in the rare indication should not be included in the designation request. Tips for estimating prevalence. Prevalence is defined as the number of individuals in the United States diagnosed with the disease or condition. Incidence is the annual number of newly diagnosed cases of a disease. Designation requests for the preventative use of a drug must include the annual number of individuals to whom the drug will be administered, and requests for therapeutic use of a drug must include the prevalence rate that is extrapolated to the most current population of the United States. Determinations of prevalence estimates for diagnostics used in the initial diagnosis of disease must follow the prevention methodology, while diagnostic products used in disease management must follow the treatment methodology. Current prevalence estimates should be used to support the orphan drug application at the time of application submission. The OOPD will consider the highest and most conservative prevalent estimate, and sponsors should provide justification for the highest prevalence estimates that they consider skewed and must state their final prevalence estimate for the indication. Sponsors must also ensure that detailed calculations of estimates and all cited references used to determine the population estimate are included in the designation request. Common sources for estimating prevalence include registries, databases, scientific peer-reviewed literature, and the United States and World Population Clock. It is unacceptable to simply state that a disease is found in a rare or on a rare disease website. So how does the OOPD assess an orphan indication? A few tips to keep in mind are, firstly, designation requests for prevention of a disease versus treatment require different approaches for determining the prevalence estimate and different supporting studies for the scientific rationale. For example, to support a successful orphan drug designation for the treatment of solid tumor indications, preclinical animal models to support the scientific rationale should be designed such that tumor growth is established before administration of the anti-cancer study drug. In so doing, anti-tumor treatment effects may be appropriately attributed to the study drug. Similarly, prevalence estimates for treatment of the solid tumor indication would be determined using the number of individuals to whom the orphan drug would be administered. Conversely, a prevention model would require that the tumor is established after the drug is administered. Secondly, the designation is granted to the broadest possible indication. For example, in the case of the disease severe malaria, the OOPD would consider the disease as simply malaria. Sponsors may submit orphan drug designation requests one of four ways: through the CDER Next-Gen portal, by emailing the required information to the OOPD mailbox. Please note that this email method was made available only because of the COVID-19 pandemic. Another method for submitting is via the FDA Form 4035 or by mailing the submission to OOPD on a CD-ROM using a tracked method such as Federal Express. The components of the orphan drug designation submission must include the following: cover letter, U.S. agent letter, if the sponsor is an international sponsor that is based outside the United States, self-certification letter to indicate that the sponsor has not previously received a marketing authorization for the same active moiety for the same rare disease, the orphan drug application itself, and all cited references. The OOPD accepts designation requests on a rolling basis. Per the FDA's 2017 Orphan Drug Modernization Plan, sponsors may expect to receive OOPD responses to designation requests within 90 days of submission. Sponsors may obtain one of three responses to their request: a designation letter, a deficiency letter, or a denial letter. All designations are posted on the Orphan Drug Designations and Approvals public website. If a deficiency letter is received, sponsors have 1 year within which to address the deficiencies and submit a response to the OOPD. Sponsors who have been granted designation also have the option to withdraw their designation. To maintain compliance with the law, Orphan Drug Designation annual reports are to be submitted within 14 months post-designation and every 12 months thereafter. Annual reports are a brief progress report summarizing the following: regulatory updates, all completed, ongoing, and planned studies, the sponsor's development plan for the upcoming year, and changes that may affect orphan drug status. Annual reports are to be submitted via email to the OOPD until marketing authorization is granted or until the designation is withdrawn. Sponsors are also required to notify the OOPD within 30 days after market authorization for the orphan drug's intended use is submitted to the FDA Review Division, as well as notify the OOPD once marketing approval has been granted so that the OOPD may assess eligibility for 7-year exclusivity. So, now that we've discussed orphan drug designations, let's briefly discuss the Orphan Drug Designation's pediatric counterpart, the Rare Pediatric Disease Designation, and its relevance to the Priority Review Voucher. The Rare Pediatric Disease Designation is the pediatric counterpart to the Orphan Drug application. The structure of the application is similar to that of the Orphan Drug Designation request, and Rare Pediatric Designation requests are also submitted to the OOPD. Sponsors may submit a rare pediatric disease request in parallel with the submission of an orphan drug designation or fast track application. The FDA will recognize the request for rare pediatric disease as submitted at the same time as the ODA or the orphan drug application and fast track application if the requests are received within 2 weeks of each other. Each request should, however, be submitted separately. That is, the application should not be submitted as a combined package. If the rare pediatric disease designation is submitted at the same time or shortly after the orphan drug designation request for the drug, then the rare pediatric disease designation may cross-reference important aspects already presented in the orphan drug designation request. Sponsors should also note in the rare pediatric disease designation requests whether a rare pediatric disease or fast track application are being submitted at the same time as the rare pediatric designation request. The rare pediatric disease designation is required for eligibility for the rare pediatric disease priority review voucher, which will be discussed shortly. The OOPD notes that in 2020, they received a record-breaking number of rare pediatric disease designation requests. Specifically, 284 rare pediatric disease designation requests were received, which is a more than 330% increase since 2019. Additionally, additional information and resources on orphan drug and rare pediatric disease designation may also be found on the OOPD's website. As previously mentioned, most rare diseases are serious or life-threatening with a high unmet medical need and most qualify for at least one expedited program. Let's discuss the key features of 4 expedited programs: Rare Pediatric Disease Priority Review Voucher, Fast Track Designation, Breakthrough Therapy Designation, and Accelerated Approval. The Rare Pediatric Disease Priority Review Voucher. Priority Review Voucher is awarded to a sponsor if it develops a drug for a rare pediatric disease and the drug is approved. The Priority Review Voucher allows a sponsor to expedite the FDA review of a future drug, and a sponsor may sell the voucher to other companies that want to expedite their drug review. Sponsors interested in rare pediatric disease priority review vouchers must note that, per the FDA, on December 27, 2020, the Rare Pediatric Disease Priority Review Voucher Program was extended. Under the current statutory sunset provisions, after September 30, 2024, FDA may only award a voucher for an approved rare pediatric disease product application if the sponsor has rare pediatric disease designation for a drug, and that designation was granted by September 30, 2024. After September 2026, FDA may not award any rare pediatric disease priority review vouchers. Among the recent rare pediatric disease priority review voucher sales between biotech and pharma company was Rhythm's sale of its priority review voucher to Alexion for $100 million. Should Rhythm use this voucher for one of its programs, it will expedite the FDA review process by months, ultimately adding a few extra months of sales for the company. Fast Track designations. Fast Track designations are intended to expedite the development of drugs for serious conditions with an unmet need. Seriousness is usually based on factors such as day-to-day functioning, survival, and likelihood that the condition may worsen or progress to a more serious condition if left untreated. An unmet need refers to providing a therapy where none exists or providing therapy potentially better than the available therapy. Minimum data required for Fast Track designations are preclinical efficacy data in animal models of the disease. The designation request may be submitted at the time of IND submission or any time during development, but ideally no later than the pre-BLA or pre-NDA meeting. They are submitted as amendments to an open IND, and the FDA determines Fast Track designation within 60 calendar days of receipt of the request. Sponsors receiving designation are eligible for more frequent meetings with the FDA to discuss their drug development plan, more frequent written communications with the agency, and eligibility for rolling review of their BLA or NDA, which means that sponsors may submit completed sections of their BLA or NDA for review rather than waiting until all sections are completed. Breakthrough therapy designations. Breakthrough therapy designations are intended to expedite the development of drugs for serious conditions, and preliminary clinical evidence indicates that the drug may demonstrate substantial improvement on a clinically significant endpoint over available therapies. Unlike Fast Track designations, investigational drugs require preliminary clinical evidence to obtain breakthrough therapy status. Breakthrough therapy designations may be submitted at the time of the IND submission or any time before marketing approval, but ideally before the end of phase 2 meeting. The FDA's response may be expected within 60 calendar days of receipt of the request, and sponsors receiving designation have the same benefits as Fast Track, but with more intensive guidance and greater organizational commitment from the agency. Sponsors should note that the FDA may later rescind breakthrough therapy designation status if the drug no longer meets the designation criteria. Accelerated approval. The accelerated approval pathway is intended to expedite the development and approval of drugs for a serious condition, and that generally provides a meaningful advantage over available therapies and demonstrates an effect on a surrogate endpoint that is reasonably likely to predict clinical benefit, or on an intermediate clinical endpoint that can be measured earlier than irreversible morbidity or mortality that is reasonably likely to predict clinical benefit. Drugs granted accelerated approval must conduct post-marketing confirmatory trials to verify and describe the anticipated clinical benefit. Sponsors should also discuss the confirmatory trials, and there should be agreement with FDA on the design and conduct to support confirmation of clinical benefit. Typically, the confirmatory trial should be already underway at the time of the request of accelerated approval. The FDA may withdraw approval of a drug or indication approved under the accelerated approval pathway. For drugs under at least one expedited program, Fast Track, Breakthrough Therapy, Accelerated Approval, or Priority Review, the clinical development time from IND application to FDA approval was 0.9 years shorter than those not under any expedited program. Development programs for drugs with Fast Track designation were reduced by approximately 1 year versus the typical 8 years. And drugs that received breakthrough therapy designation demonstrated greatest advantage by reducing development times from 8 years to 4.8 years. Additional information on all of FDA's expedited program designations may be found in the FDA guidance document, Expedited Programs for Serious Conditions, Drugs, and Biologics. That's you.
Okay, great. Thanks very much, Christine. I'm going to pick the talk up here and provide a bit of additional information on the EU Orphan designation process, with a focus on the differences between the FDA submission and designation process. This slide just reviews the available incentives tied to the EMA Orphan drug designation. I'll review these briefly and contrast them with the FDA incentives. Firstly, EMA designation provides 10 years of market exclusivity, and this period can be extended by an additional 2 years for medicines that also have completed an agreed to pediatric investigational plan. This compares to 7 years of exclusivity for the FDA, as Christine previously discussed. So it also highlights a difference in the incentive structure between the health authorities. Whereas the FDA provides a waiver from pediatric studies with orphan designation, EMA actually supports their completion through increased market exclusivity. So the downstream ramification of this is that sponsors with orphan designation will typically need to submit a pediatric investigational plan and should plan accordingly. Sponsors also qualify for protocol assistance at a reduced charge. The amount of this reduction is linked to a fee reduction scale that depends on the status of the sponsor. So this is a little different from the FDA. No comparable incentive exists for US orphan designations, and the reason for that is because protocol discussions are typically managed through the review division. So this takes place without an associated cost. That said, the value of EMA protocol assistance lies in the specific focus on orphan drug clinical development. This is a little bit in contrast to the FDA approach, where sponsors are typically encouraged to request OOPD representation on milestone meetings, but the meetings themselves are handled through the review division. Additionally, all designated orphan medicines are assessed for marketing authorization through the centralized procedure. This allows companies to make a single application to the European Medicine Agency, resulting in a single opinion and a single decision from the European Commission, valid in all of the EU member states. So just a little bit on the process. This slide just illustrates the general EMA ODD assessment process. The first thing that I would note is that sponsors have to submit applications per the EMA submission calendar. So unlike the FDA, the EMA utilizes a series of pre-planned submission deadlines. The table of submission deadlines is posted on the EMA website, and it's very important to plan carefully around that deadline. Failure to do so can result in time losses of a month or more. So know your benchmarks around the application building and have a plan to hit those benchmarks by the application deadline. If you don't have access to the IRIS database, be sure to have a plan to set that up as well. In particular, both the application content and the portal permissions should converge around that EMA submission calendar date, or ideally slightly before that date. So within 60 days of the submission deadline, the EMA will complete the validation of the application. The purpose of this validation step is to ensure that the content of the application meets the requirements as specified in the guidelines, including acceptance of the condition, demonstration of medical plausibility, credibility of the prevalence discussion, and justification of significant benefit. I would just point out, and I'll point this out at the end of the talk as well, that detailed guidance exists for all of these elements. And it's very critical to follow these guidances as literally as possible. This is another key difference between the FDA and the EMA. In general, the EMA guidances are a little bit more specific and thus should be addressed in a systematic and specific manner. Failure to do so may result in a validation supplementary information letter. And if the sponsor is unable to address the concerns in that letter, possible need for resubmission. So if there are doubts about the ability to meet guidance specifications, sponsors would definitely be advised to request a pre-submission meeting. So following validation, the EMA scientific officer and COMP rapporteur prepare a summary report on the application. The summary report typically includes data reported in the sponsor's application, a critical review, and a conclusion. This report is then shared with the Committee for Orphan Medical Products, or COMP. The COMP then produces a list of questions for the sponsor. Typically, this list of questions will be made available to the sponsor within the draft summary report and within 3 working days following the meeting. The sponsor will then be asked to respond in writing or to attend an oral explanation at the next COMP meeting. Following the oral explanation or written response, the COMP will issue an opinion. Notably, before that point, sponsors are given the opportunity to withdraw the application following the discussion if the outcome appears to be unfavorable. So sponsors will make this call when they have concerns that the initial decision could affect subsequent applications. However, this situation can generally be avoided by taking advantage of the pre-submission pathway. In general, any major issues around prevalence calculation or medical plausibility are more efficiently addressed through pre-submission rather than going through the whole process and then having to withdraw the application for deficiencies. So this table just compares and contrasts the major components of orphan drug applications in the US and the EU. So besides the structural differences in the application, which are relatively easy to parse out and delineate, there are some conceptual differences as well. These include the methodology for estimation of prevalence, subtle differences between the EU concept of medical plausibility and the scientific rationale specified by the FDA, the limited or non-existent applicability of the FDA orphan subset concept in the EU, and the differences between the EU concept of significant benefit and the FDA's definition of clinical superiority. In general, attempting to bridge these concepts can result in more rework down the road, and a better approach is to submit the applications in parallel, but to conceive of them as 2 separate applications with different legal foundations and associated guidances. Sponsors should be very careful to adapt regulatory language appropriate for their specific submission and not to copy and paste language from one application to another. In my experience, one of the key challenges with EMA orphan applications, particularly early development applications, is medical plausibility. In particular, if medical plausibility is to be based on animal models, it's a very good idea to get together with your non-clinical team early and really interrogate the applicability of a given model to the proposed disease condition. EMA has demonstrated a strong preference for established preclinical models with good predictive value in the disease condition. This can be challenging, particularly with rare conditions, but this is another area where a pre-submission meeting can be valuable in strengthening the application. In addition, it's a very good idea to research previous designations extensively to determine the relative validation of animal models within a given disease space. Armed with this knowledge, sponsors can then determine if such a meeting is a necessary due diligence exercise. In general, this is one area where a defense that meets the EMA standards is going to meet FDA standards as well. Lastly, I just want to reiterate that a sponsor should not wait until the last minute to establish their IRIS platform. Do this work along with the initial drafting of the application to ensure no glitches on submission day. Remember, failure to prepare in this regard can result in a delay until the next submission review cycle. This is easily avoidable by ensuring the team members that are aware of the portal have proper access as well as familiarity with the structure of the submission within IRES in advance of the submission. So just a few of the guidances and laws cited in this talk. As discussed previously, the EMA guidances are pretty detailed and should be followed carefully. In addition, parallel applications should be tailored as much as possible to the guidance language relevant to the specific health authority. So read widely and note the differences both in terms of content required and expression of that content relative to the specific guidances. So with that in mind, I will close out the talk and ask if there are any specific questions. I'd like to thank everyone for attending as well.
Thank you, Ben and Christine, for your insights. Now we'd like to move forward with the Q&A portion of the webinar. I'll hand it back to the presenters.
Okay, great. So it looks like we have a few questions here for Christine dealing with FDA and OOPD. So I'll just start there. So how does the OOPD generally deal with deficiencies? Are information requests common, or does the OOPD typically proceed straight to a refusal to grant?
So the OOPD typically has information requests, typically what we refer to as abeyance letters are issued to sponsors. And these letters essentially outline any deficiencies or additional information that the OOPD would like to see in order for the sponsor to have a successful orphan drug designation. As mentioned earlier in the webinar, sponsors have 1 year within which to respond to these deficiencies. And the OOPD is, I'd say, pretty flexible in terms of communicating or corresponding with sponsors with respect to specific information that's required to satisfy those abeyance letters.
Thanks, Christine. Another one relating to OOPD. In your experience, does the OOPD generally meet the 90-day review timeframe?
Yes, I'd say they typically do. In fact, we typically tend to see designations granted within 45 days or so. If it takes longer than 45 days, then I think it would be fair to say that perhaps a deficiency letter is in order. But yes, they typically respond within the 90-day timeframe.
Great, thanks, Christine. Here's one relating more to EMA. Sponsors interested in obtaining orphan drug designations in both the US and the EU often query whether to submit applications in parallel using the common application form. Do you recommend using this form for parallel submissions or submitting separately to each agency? In my opinion, it is better to submit in parallel using the specific template that EMA has set out for their submissions, and then just doing the FDA based on sort of the structure that they recommend. It's not completely clear to me, since the implementation of the IRIS system, what kinds of parallel reviews and interactions are taking place between the health authorities. And generally, I just like to err on the side of caution and use those separate templates just to make sure that I've checked off all the boxes. And preferably, if you can get your submissions in parallel, that's ideal. But definitely consider using the guidance and the recommended templates for each health authority separately. And then one more question. I think this is also for OOPD. What can we expect after the initial submission of the application?
That's a good question, actually. So once the application is submitted by one of the 4 methods that we mentioned earlier in the webinar, then the OOPD will reply to the sponsor during the pandemic, obviously via email, with an acknowledgement letter. And that acknowledgement letter will have a designation request number, and that number should be used by the sponsor for any future correspondences. Again, there's a 90-day timeline, and within those 90 days, usually within about 45 days or so, the sponsor may expect to receive a designation letter. But obviously, if there are deficiencies or gaps in the application, then they may expect to receive an abeyance letter or a deficiency letter, but still within that 90-day timeframe. If designation is granted, then the annual reports are required. And as mentioned earlier, the first annual report is to be submitted within 14 months after designation, and then every 12 months or annually thereafter. So it's a fairly straightforward process. Again, submitting by one of the preferred methods, waiting for that acknowledgement letter, and then complying with all of the other post-designation activities once designation is granted.
Great, thanks, Christine. It looks like we have one more, and I'll just put this one out there. To submit an ODD in the US, you mentioned that data describing similar indications should not be included. But what about similar drugs? For example, if a company has preclinical data in the indication with the sister drug, can it still be possible to make links to that?
That's a really good question, a very common question, and the answer is no. I would advise against that because the OOPD is very clear on the requirements for a successful orphan drug designation. The designation is granted to the active moiety. So if we're submitting a request with a quote unquote similar drug, then that wouldn't be accepted unless that quote unquote similar drug shares the same active moiety or active ingredient as the drug that's really ought to be the subject of the designation request. So I think that's a very nuanced one, but you should bear in mind the active moiety. If they do share the same moiety, then yes, you can go ahead and use that information in your orphan drug designation submission. But if they're similar but do not share the same active moiety, then I would strongly advise against that.
Excellent. Thanks, Christine. It looks like that's all the questions we had.
Okay, if you have any additional questions on what you heard today, please follow up with your point of contact directly or email media@mmsholdings.com and we'll direct you to a presenter. The next edition of our rare disease series will take place on October 27th and will focus on strategies for rare disease data analysis, doing more with less, presented by a team of MMS biostatistics and data science experts. To register for the next rare disease webinar and for additional free webinars, visit mmsholdings.com/webinars or follow us on LinkedIn. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, everyone.